Good evening, dear friends. Welcome to this last of a series of contemplations exploring the mysteries and the wonders of Holy Week and today, Easter. Easter Sunday here in the central United States. But when you just think, we are a circle of human beings around this mystery of Easter, this mystery of death and resurrection. And just imagine this circle as being a circle of human beings encompassing the globe. That our friends in New Zealand and Australia are already well into the second day of Eastertide. And that movement of Easter will cross the earth, will come in to Asia, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, the West, Africa, will cross the Atlantic and enter the Western Hemisphere until it, so to speak, jumps off the West Coast and ends in the West. And so I often imagine our act of consecration of man, the candles being lit, let's say in New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Japan. We make a pretty big jump to Georgia, Ukraine, the Baltic countries, and Europe, Great Britain, across the Atlantic. You might say here's a fire, a physical fire lit by a human being with a match and a taper and a candle. But this is a fire that does not extinguish, as long as those who see it, who experience it, take it deep into their heart and carry it with them. And so yesterday it was, I believe, I posted on my Facebook page a film of a small ritual that a number of hospital chaplains in Amsterdam performed in an empty chapel, symbolic of the time we live in, where people are not able to gather as closely together as they would like to do. 4 hospital chaplains who light all of the candles in that chapel from one central baptism candle. And they sing a song that comes to us from the community of Taizé, in which we hear, "Into our darkness, send a light, a fire that never goes out, a glowing fire that will never extinguish." And this chant goes on until all of the candles in that chapel are lit and burning. And so I imagine that Easter, no, I don't imagine, I experience that Easter, this first breaking of light, lights that fire in myself, in my soul, rekindles the light that's been there all of the time. A light that was given to us when we entered the world, when we were born. A light given to us by parents, people who spent their time around us, took care of us, raised us, taught us. And that light is something that can seem to disappear. And sometimes it takes real effort to find it again, to rekindle it, to allow it to inspire you. And so in the Christian community, we've been studying for years and years and years that same book again and again and again, that book we call the New Testament, and especially the 4 Gospels. It seems no matter how often we come back to those maybe 80, 90 pages of typewritten text, they never get old. The fire might get dim, might get very small sometimes, and yet sitting together, listening to the words, picturing the events, calling the presence of the Christ into our midst, rekindles that fire so that we can confirm that it never does go out. And so several years ago, when I was working in Amsterdam, I announced there would be 4 evenings on the resurrection, each evening dedicated to one of the gospel writers. And one of the congregants said, 4 evenings? We're going to spend several hours on 4 evenings looking at the gospel, the resurrection story. It's still quite simple. Jesus died and rose from the grave, and now we're saved. Well, I said to that person, you know, I agree totally. I believe that, absolutely. And then he looked at me a little quizzically, and I said, but I want to experience that, and I want to experience it together. And how best to do that than to allow the pictures of the resurrection story to, as it were, pass before us, to listen to them. We studied some artwork, we did some artwork. And the question was, how can I come to know this as a truth in my own life? And of course, there are 4 Gospels. There are many Gospels in circulation. The 4 that we know best, that are currently in the New Testament, actually tell 4 slightly different stories. And then you wonder, couldn't they get their facts straight? Couldn't they have checked with each other that we tell the same story? Well, they could have. I don't think they did, because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not some kind of reporters supplying facts for the local media. They were each in their own right. 2 of them in their own right were actual eyewitnesses. Matthew and John were disciples of Jesus. The other 2 were disciples of Paul, who had his own very special access to the resurrection story. That would be another, that would fill several books to get behind that. Let's leave Paul out of this for now. Each of these 4 evangelists were initiates in their own right, had been schooled and trained, they had suffered, they had known joys, and in their own retelling of the story, they make us part of their own inner spiritual experiences. Experiences that were revealed to them in their higher work on the spiritual plane. And they not only had the experiences, but they had the gift to tell it, to write it down, so that we can hear and see and believe and begin to transform our own lives when we look at them together. So let's just do a little experiment. I'm indebted to one of my very early Christian community priest colleagues, Friedrich Gaedeke, who wrote a book about the Gospel of Luke. And in it, he looks at the resurrection stories and tells us something very interesting. I'd like to share that with you. And please feel free to get out your own Bible, read these stories, lay them next to each other, and see what you come up with. I'd be very interested to hear. I'd just like to share a little bit of the story that has meant a lot to me in the course of time. So Matthew and Mark tell us that women were on their way to the grave to take care of the body of Jesus. Now, Jesus was buried very quickly on Friday. Some evangelists report without all of the prescribed ritual acts. And so they wanted to catch up, as it were, on Sunday morning. Matthew tells us that they see an angel before they enter the grave. He's sitting outside on this large stone that had covered the entrance to the grave. Mark tells us that they enter the grave, and once they are inside, they have a supersensible experience, and they see a young being, a spiritual being, in white, who shows them the place where the body had lain. And we might say this is an old form of seeing, of having visions of the spiritual world. Luke tells a slightly different version. He says, Also, they find the stone rolled away. Nothing happens. They go into the grave. Still nothing happens. But not until they see the place where Jesus had lain. Then their souls are shaken to their very roots. And then they see two beings with brilliant white clothes. John tells another story. He tells us that Peter and another disciple were running to the grave, trying to get there as quickly as possible, and they stopped just outside of the grave. Peter, we've gotten to know Peter a little bit in these evenings, Peter goes right in. John stays outside. John goes in later, and when he sees what has happened in the grave, he sees that the grave cloths that had been wrapped around the body of Jesus are strewn aside, that the cloth that laid on his face is neatly folded in a corner. Then, on the basis of what he has seen in the physical world, his vision is lifted to the spiritual. And we see in this very subtle change between what Matthew and Mark experience on the one side and what Luke and John experience as a further development of the ability to see into the spiritual world through the physical world. By perceiving what is right in front of them, they are lifted out of their daily container, you might say, and their inner senses are stimulated, are awakened, so that they are able to see past the veil of the spiritual and begin to realize within themselves, in their own heart, in their own thoughts, what has happened. Not that the body has disappeared. That wouldn't be very difficult to do. Anyone could have done that. The body has not disappeared. The body has disintegrated. What little material substance was left of the body of Jesus of Nazareth has fallen into the earth, has become one with the earth. And the spiritual being of the Christ, he is standing outside, waiting for the next person who came to the grave. John tells us that Mary Magdalene, after John and Peter have been to the grave, Mary Magdalene comes and sees a figure walking through the garden and asks, "Where have they taken my Lord? Can you tell me? I will go to him." And not until this person, this being, says the name Mary, awakens then within her the recognition that she is standing in front of the risen Lord. It's puzzling, isn't it, that she didn't recognize him? Something has changed. A new being has arisen from the grave. The old material body is gone. The Spirit of Christ has rebuilt itself, has rebuilt the new human being. And now, this skilled teacher is going to go about reawakening all of the things he has said to his disciples from the very beginning. From the very beginning, he was placing seeds in their hearts and minds. And now the shock of the last 3 days has loosened the hold of their mind and heart in their physical body, and they are lifted into a seeing, into a vision of the spiritual world. The spirit world becomes concrete and real for them, and not only a matter of teaching, of hearing and believing. So just as the Christ, this cosmic being, came to the earth out of the worldwide spaces, inhabited, thoroughly permeated the being of Jesus of Nazareth, experienced human death, and descended into the earth, the underworld, as a seed. So the disciples now are called to receive this seed, to awaken what has been planted in them, and to carry this seed, this word of Christ, out into the world, and in turn to sow it in the hearts and minds of all those who will listen. That's us. We're still listening to them. It seems that every year we can listen to the same stories again and again, and they're not just words. Because, dear friends, you and I are different this year than we were last Easter, I hope. I hope we've experienced and gone through enough that we look at the world maybe just a little bit differently than we did a year ago, and a year before that, and a year before that, and a year from now. We will also be in a different place, and we will hear these same words, whether we read Mark 16, or Luke 24, or John 20, 21, Matthew 28. The stories of the resurrection will still be there, but we will be in a different place. Our ability to hear, to see, to believe, and to act on our beliefs will have gotten stronger. That light, that fire that has come to us from our spiritual guides, our angels, the archangels, that light that has been lit in us, that fire that burns in us, we have to take care of it, but it's not going anywhere. It's going to stay burning. Watch out. And so the Easter prayer that we hear at the beginning and the end of the act of consecration of man in the Christian community, that begins with a very simple statement. The grave is empty. The heart is full. Warmth transforms what was into what can still become. And then we hear the admonition at the end. Your word go forth. Spirit waken from your mouth. Christ is risen to you as the meaning of the earth. May we each year again, anew, afresh, find this meaning in your life, in my life, in the life of the world around us. I wish you a blessed Eastertide, and I hope to come back perhaps with some more insights in a week or two. Just keep track of Facebook and you'll find out. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here. Give each other a hand all around the world. Squeeze each other's hand and say, I'm here. We're here. Good night.